Since his big screen debut in 2002, we've seen a lot of Spider-Man. He's appeared in his own movies and become a major part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, though his fate there is to be determined. Each installment of Spider-Man has its ups and downs. With Into the Spider-Verse making a splash, it'll be the fourth film iteration of the web-slinging hero, all within the last couple decades. But which Spider-Man is truly king? In order to determine the best cinematic Spidey, there's a few categories to look at. Let's start with the actors who've played the superhero. Tobey Maguire was the first Spider-Man, so he's always going to cast a big shadow. Maguire was 27 years old when the first Spider-Man movie came out in 2002. That's a bit old to be playing a high schooler, but Maguire still looked like Peter Parker come to life. And he fit in very well with many of director Sam Raimi's comedic flourishes. Maguire delivers all of Spider-Man's signature quips well, and can even pull off some impeccable slapstick humor.
Raindrops are falling on my head, they keep falling, so I just did.
Andrew Garfield was cast following his breakthrough role in The Social Network. Like Maguire, Garfield was a bit older, but he gave Spider-Man a little bit of a darker edge. In many ways, Garfield's version is cooler than Maguire's version. Garfield captured the term nerd in a more modern sense, where it's not just associated with being bullied. This Peter Parker even skateboards. Garfield was 29 years old when The Amazing Spider-Man came out, which is even older than Maguire was when the first Spider-Man was released. Yet, the heavy dose of teen angst he added to the character made him seem younger. Unfortunately, he didn't have the goofy innocence Maguire had, which is a huge part of what makes Peter Parker, Peter Parker. Tom Holland first popped up in Captain America: Civil War for a scene-stealing performance.
Hey everyone.
He then got his own platform in Homecoming in 2017. Holland's performance brought a new energy to the character. Not to mention, he got the part at age 20, which made him the youngest actor to get the role. For once, the character actually felt like a high schooler. As an added bonus, Holland gave Peter a bit of a New York accent. Garfield did too, but this one feels the most like he's just a kid from Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. But I'm good.
Shameik Moore voices Miles Morales, a character who first put on the Spider-Man mask in Ultimate Fallout No. 4 in 2011. Since then, Morales has become a fan favorite, and fans have been begging for a movie for years. Is it fair to judge Miles versus the other versions of Spider-Man with Peter Parker under the mask? I say, why not? Though we only have a voice performance to go off of, Moore ends up being a great choice. He proves to be an incredibly convincing high schooler.
How many more Spider people are there?
Next, let's talk about the movies themselves. There were a lot of things outside the fight scenes that gave the original trilogy an added dose of drama. And say what you will about the third movie, but the trilogy works together to build a fascinating portrait of a character split between power and responsibility.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
In the first movie, Peter Parker's unrequited love for Mary Jane is a big highlight. The tension of MJ liking Spider-Man, who can forget that upside-down kiss, while being just friends with Peter added a special sense of intrigue outside of the main action. In the second movie, Peter looks like a bad friend and nephew every time he has to run out to be the hero. He bears the burden of being Spider-Man all alone. Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 were, at the core, about Peter Parker learning to balance standing for justice and his commitments to those he cared about in his life. By the end of the second movie, Mary Jane knows that Peter is Spider-Man, but in the third movie, that knowledge becomes a problem. Peter recreates that famous kiss with Gwen Stacy, and now Mary Jane clearly sees the moments that Peter chooses hero work over her, which pushes her briefly into the arms of Peter's one-time best friend, Harry Osborn. Harry is interesting because, like Mary Jane, he learns about Peter's alter ego, but it causes him to hate his old friend because Spider-Man killed his father. Though Spider-Man 3 is connected to the other two on a character level, overall it goes pretty off the rails. Emo Spidey was a choice. And overall, it just has too much going on, which would become a problem in the next Spider-Man reboot. Garfield's movies have less of a connecting thread. The films work best when they're taking a different direction than the earlier trilogy, but ultimately, it's too similar for a new series with hardly any time separating it from the earlier version.
Uncle Ben, call an ambulance! Someone call an ambulance, Uncle Ben!
This version rehashes Uncle Ben's death. Peter faces off against the same bully at school, Harry's his best friend who turns into a villain, and he's pretty much battling the same problems and demons. But like I said, when it's different, it's better. In this version, Gwen Stacy, who doesn't show up until Spider-Man 3 in the first version, is Peter's love interest. Garfield and Emma Stone have solid chemistry. Another part that worked was giving more of Peter's early backstory by introducing us to his parents. But the filmmakers were never able to shake off the decision to retell Spider-Man's origin story, and didn't do enough to differentiate Garfield's Spider-Man, while Maguire's was still fresh in our minds. Homecoming was smart in that it decided to skip over Spider-Man's origin story, which we'd already seen twice on the big screen. It went right into where his story left off, following the events in Germany from Civil War. At the end of the day, everything about Homecoming is fresh. He's a brand new love interest, a new funny best friend who's not named Harry. MJ comes as a surprise towards the end of the movie, and even his high school bully Flash is completely reimagined.
Are you really friends with Peter Parker?
The biggest change was adding Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, to this story, giving Peter a new and interesting father figure in lieu of Uncle Ben. Tony Stark might have a reputation for being reckless, but he turns out to be very good at giving teenage Peter Parker a few stern lectures and forbidding his access to a high-tech suit. All of this eventually led to the biggest emotional payoff of Infinity War.
Start? I don't feel so good.
You're all right.
I don't know what's happening. I don't know.
Into the Spider-Verse might be the most ambitious Spider-Man movie yet, bringing us into multiple universes in ways that are mind-bending, fun, and funny. Miles doesn't appear to get pushed around by bullies as much as some of the other previous iterations were. His struggles deal with adapting and fitting into his tough new school, while navigating a relationship with his tough but loving cop father, who has a complicated relationship with Spider-Man himself.
Spider-Man swings in once a day, zip-zaps up in his little mask and answers to no one.
Miles' Spider-Man origin story is slightly different from the others, and it feels much more streamlined. After 3 iterations of Peter Parker, it's nice to see a completely new character taking on the mantle, breathing fresh life into the beloved comic book character. One thing of note, Miles is Afro-Latino, which was always a big part of his story since his introduction in the comics. Gwen Stacy is back here once again, but this time she gets to take a stab at being a superhero, yet another of this movie's very refreshing twists. And in this movie, Peter Parker is washed up, but he ultimately assumes an Uncle Ben role as a mentor to Miles. It's a very different Spider-Man than we're used to seeing. In fact, Miles has many role models to choose from between Peter, his father, and his Uncle Aaron. A hero is only as good as the villains they have to fight. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man faced off against some all-time great villains. In the first movie, Willem Dafoe played Green Goblin. He was a terrifying presence as a man at war within himself. And as a kid first watching this movie, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of wanted that glider. In the second movie, Alfred Molina played Dr. Octopus, maybe one of the coolest looking villains of all time. Like Green Goblin, his origin story was built on loss and lack of control. There is something both tragic and compelling about his backstory. Both villains were played by world-class actors, and most interestingly, both villains were people from Peter Parker's life, which complicated things when it came to fight. Spider-Man 3, however, suffered from too many villains, It was an interesting choice that Peter was overtaken by the alien symbiotes line, turning the hero into a bit of a villain himself, but anything rewarding about that got lost in the fray between all the other bad guys like Eddie Brock's Venom, Sandman, and Harry Osborn's version of the Goblin. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had Spidey facing off against the Lizard, played by Rhys Ifans, yet another scientist whose work went to his head. It was fine, but felt a little familiar by that point. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 gave Spider-Man too many villains to fight against at once. This was a major part of its downfall. It's hard to pick what was worse, the laughably bad CGI of Electro, or the Rhino, which was thrown in for absolutely no reason at the end of the second Amazing movie as a cliffhanger for a sequel that never came. The most compelling villain might have been Harry Osborn's Goblin, but we only got a little peek at him towards the end. Homecoming bounced back, pitting Spider-Man against the Vulture, played by Michael Keaton, who also has another iconic superhero role under his belt. Keaton gives a great performance, and the added twist that he plays Peter's love interest's father was unexpected. What Homecoming did really well was play to fanboys and girls in a very subtle way.
Now you're the Shocker.
We see another Spider-Man villain, Shocker, wearing sleeves reminiscent of the comic book version of the character. It's a nice nod to a comic book villain without overwhelming us with too many bad guys to keep track of. And Miles Morales faces off against Kingpin. You probably recognize Kingpin from the Daredevil movie and TV series. He's been played by Michael Clark Duncan and Vincent D'Onofrio. Now, he's voiced by Liev Schreiber.
It's not always about the money, Spider-Man.
Who knew that one villain could cause so much ire for so many Marvel heroes? Movie adaptations should be allowed some creative freedom, but it's always an added bonus when they take loyal fans into consideration. Maguire's movies made one big change. Spider-Man's web shooters come with all his new spider powers. In the comics, Spider-Man designs the webs himself. This might seem like a minor detail, but with organic webs, we get less of a glimpse into the character's intellect and inventiveness. This one difference has caused an uproar, even to this day. The Green Goblin's look was also modernized, but that was probably for the best. The Goblin's purple outfit probably wouldn't have translated well in cinemas. Still, some of the movie scenes, like the wrestling scene and his confrontation with Uncle Ben's killer, were like shot-by-shot remakes of Stan Lee's early comics. The Amazing movies gave Spider-Man his homemade web shooters back, and with that, a great wrong felt righted. Director Mark Webb said that he met with Stan Lee while developing the film and discussed how the homemade web shooters served to dramatize Peter's intellect. Many other major moments from the comics were there, like Gwen Stacy's tragic death, which happened in a very similar fashion in the movie. Even the green coat Gwen wears in the movie matches her coat from her comic book death. And, as we mentioned, the Amazing movies had an issue with its villains. However, Green Goblin in Amazing Spider-Man 2, portrayed by Dane DeHaan, looks at least a little bit more similar to the Green Goblin portrayed in some versions of the comics. Homecoming takes tech to a whole other level. Spider-Man has an internet-powered suit that is partially controlled by Tony Stark. That suit isn't just meant to one-up Holland's big-screen Spider-Man predecessors, but rather, it's directly taken from the Civil War comic book series. There are little ways that Homecoming connected itself to the larger Spider-Man universe. Donald Glover pops up as a criminal named Aaron Davis. In one scene, he references his nephew, Miles Morales, who we get to know better in Into the Spider-Verse. Glover voiced Morales in the Ultimate Spider-Man TV series and an unsuccessful 2010 Twitter campaign to get Donald Glover cast as Spider-Man famously went viral.
My name is Miles Morales, and I'm Spider-Man.
Into the Spider-Verse is partially based off of Spider-Verse, a 2014 comic book storyline. It's also inspired by Spider-Man's indelible mark on pop culture history. The screenwriting team did their best to remain faithful to the source material, but they couldn't get in every single alternative version of Spider-Man into the film. Yes, Spider-Ham is a real Marvel Comics character, as are Spider-Man Noir and Penny Parker. But Into the Spider-Verse is also faithful to the movies, making very clear from the start that it's connected to the Tobey Maguire trilogy. Through a groundbreaking combination of CGI and hand-drawn animation, Into the Spider-Verse looks like a comic book in motion. Producers Phil Lord and Chris Miller wanted audiences to feel like they're walking inside a comic book, and at that, they succeeded. Based on the actors, the story, the villains, and their faithfulness to the comics, my conclusion is that Tom Holland's is the best version of Spider-Man. I'd say Spider-Man 2 is the absolute best movie featuring Spider-Man. Into the Spider-Verse has the most unique story, and the Andrew Garfield movies probably can't even be measured on the same scale. But between the awesome suit, the formidable foe, the actor, and the ultimately heartbreaking story arc, we are giving this one to Tom Holland and the Spider-Man of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Do you agree with our choice? Who's your favorite Spider-Man? Let us know in the comments.